Yo, yo. This is Stars with Magic, where we talk about the stars with magic and magic. And today we are discussing Sun in the 8th house synastry. Okay. If this video was helpful, if you liked it, if you resonated with it, or if you would like to share your story, please leave a comment. Like the video, subscribe, and definitely reach out for a synastry reading, birth chart reading, or even personal coaching. Okay. So now that I start the video, everybody wants to be right outside my window. Okay. Now, when it comes to the 8th house, this is probably one of the most challenging, difficult, growth inspiring, transformational type of aspects you could have in synastry. Yes, Pluto is quite similar to it, but the level of intensity and extremity tends to be a lot more pronounced and obvious. It's completely different. It's completely different. So, do yourself a favor and don't compare Pluto aspects to 8th house aspects. Okay. With that being said, the 8th house has everything to do with the darkness in one person. The 8th house is the house where everything bad that's ever happened to you, any life disappointments, traumas, heartbreaks, insecurities, or just unresolved issues that really nobody knows about, come and rest here. So this is it's a very dark place. It's a very dark and vulnerable place in somebody's chart. The best way that I can describe it, or one of the ways that I can describe it, is like, if you've ever seen the movie Castaway, there's a moment where Tom Hanks is, he's trying to escape the island, and he ends up getting severely injured in the ocean. He's wounded. He's lost a lot of, trigger warning, blood. And he's trying to survive. He's probably reaching a place of hopelessness, right? And he finds this cave. And, he's desperate. He's looking for water. He's starving. It's survival, right? And a rainstorm starts. And he enters into this cave where, due to exhaustion, he finds a place where he can stay out of the rain. He lays there and he just basically passes out. Okay. The cave is the 8th house, and the person's 8th house, the 8th house that the person belongs to is Tom Hanks. I don't know. Anyway, that's the best way that I could describe it. So the 8th house really has to do with survival. Sometimes we repress things that we go through in order to survive, in order to make it through life, and so it's an extremely vulnerable place. Okay. Now, the Sun individual is the essence of a person. It's their ego, it's their persona, it's the foundation of the rest of the personality. So what you're gonna find here is that, and of course, the Sun is it's the brightest part of our personality. Okay. It's not a vulnerable placement. It's the ego is never really, it's probably the strength of the personality, to be honest. Okay, so when the strength of one person, the ego and the foundation of one person comes into the most sensitive, vulnerable, and wounded place of another person, we're going to find that it can feel a lot like a one-sided experience for the 8th house person. It could be very lonely for the 8th house person. It's a lot different when we have somebody's moon here. Extreme worlds different. Okay, but we really see a lot of the signatures of the 8th house. You know, a lot of the time the 8th house person is going to be the one that is the one that's going to change the most, the one that has the opportunity to grow the most. Depending on the 8th house person and what, you know, where they are in terms of like spiritual growth and maturity, is going to really alter and create its own unique flavor to each individual experience. And so one thing that I really do have to say here is that your 8th house experience, if you're the 8th house person, or even if you're the sun person, is going to really alter. It's really going to be dependent on how the 8th house person needs to grow. If they can even perceive their level of maturity, their ability to reflect on themselves, you know, the 8th house person is probably going to be, in any 8th house connection, is going to be the one that struggles the most. So I would hope that the one watching this video is the 8th house person, because really this could help you more than the sun person. But, you know, that's only if you're really able to self-reflect and decide that you want to grow. Okay, now I've seen this connection work out in a few different ways, and of course everybody's different, their spiritual growth is different, but I've had my fair share of 8th house experiences, trust me. I've had, I want to say, maybe three or four, I can really only list 3 off the top of my head, but 3 very significant 8th house experiences, and they've all been extremely different. Okay, so I'm going to list out to you the best way that I can, the different ways or the different times in the 8th house person's evolution that these types of connections will come and how it might work out. Okay, so I want to say there could be a person that is maybe gone through so much disappointment, right? All of the maybe negative experiences in, and we're going to focus on romance here, right? We can definitely, I'll make another video on like maybe friendships and stuff like that, but this is specifically focusing on romance. Of course you could still glean from it if it's a friendship or family type of thing. So anyway, so there's gonna come a point in time, or could come a point in time, where the 8th house individual is you know, shut off a part of themselves, the vulnerable part of themselves, for maybe a very long time, and one day they decide, you know what, I want to feel love again. I want to have hope again. I want to have hope for love again. I want to learn how to love, right? And so there could come a point in time where very soon after, either they make that decision or, you know, reach that point where boom, almost instantly, the sun individual shows up, right? And that sun individual radiates on the hopelessness of the eighth house person. Now, what could happen is, because of, when you've gone through so much disappointment and so much heartbreak, and you get to that point where you lose hope, there's going to be a lot of healing that needs to take place, because I believe that there's never a hopeless case. There's always the potential for love. And maybe I'm an idealist, but so really, in order to open up, or to gain the skills required to really love, that person is going to have to experience some sort of breaking of that hopelessness, breaking of that sorrow. Okay, I might have to make a part 2. So if I do, I will let you know, or you can visit my channel and see if I made a part 2. But anyways, so that sun individual could show the eighth house person how to love. They could be actively showing the eighth house person love. But what could happen is maybe the insecurities, the doubt, the memories of negative personal experiences will be triggered by the love of the sun individual. Okay, excuse me. And so what happens is, the eighth house person at different points in time will be triggered by the love, the devotion, the comfort, and the doubts will creep in. The reminders of the pain can plague them to the point where they reject the sun house individual. And they might not want to. But there's just this something inside them that gets triggered. And there's always going to be kind of a level of triggering when it comes to the eighth house and any eighth house connection. It can be both. It can be both people that get triggered. And there's always going to be, I've never experienced or even witnessed an eighth house connection where there wasn't an extreme mutual either fascination or real, physical attraction, like major physical attraction, right? And what's funny about these eighth house connections, especially with the sun, is that, the sun, they're just living their life like do, right? Especially because this is the soul, the brightness of one personality. They're attracted, they're deeply drawn in by just the presence, the energy of the eighth house person. I mean, it's just a complete magnetic encounter. Okay, so the sun individual is going to walk into the life of the eighth house person, and they're going to think that, it's going to be a positive experience, and maybe they're excited to see the eighth house person. It's funny because I've noticed multiple times that the eighth house person is just going to have this completely sexy aura. I've seen other eighth house connections as well, not just mine. But that sexiness, there's just this physicality about the eighth house person that really sucks in the sun individual. And so the sun individual is just living their life casually, and then boom, they're hit with this connection with the eighth house person, and they had no idea what they were walking into. Okay, they just knew that they wanted to get to know this person because this person was extremely attractive and intriguing. There was something mysterious about this person, something just deeply, sexually attractive. Okay, and so there's going to be this extreme mutual attraction. There could be even a lot of affection. The eighth house person usually is going to be that one that's probably longing for the sun house person a bit more. And depending on their personal evolution or where they're at, they might be very afraid to show it. Okay. But anyways, what could end up happening in this first example that I'm sharing with you is that the 8th house person kind of really hurts the sun individual. And if the sun individual is very, if they have healthy self-esteem, boundaries, or even depending on the degree in which it hurt them, they could totally walk away from the 8th house individual, and the 8th house person is going to have to go through a process of wondering what they did wrong. It could be a very heartbreaking experience. It can be very difficult. A lot of the time when we have somebody's sun in our 8th house, they are not ready to deal with that level of depth. It can be very different with a moon in the 8th house, right? Very different situation, and sometimes very different outcomes. So that's definitely something to consider. Another way that I've seen it work out is, and usually, I mean, just across the board, these sun in the 8th house experiences usually come about when the 8th house individual is already in a very vulnerable place. Whether if they just had endured maybe a traumatic loss or a heartbreak, or are just barely making it by emotionally. The 8th house person is typically, on a moment-to-moment basis, very unaware of how they are interacting and dealing with the sun person. And of course, it can start off very casual, but it gets extremely deep very quickly. Very, very quickly. Okay, so another way that I've seen it work out is, let's say, as I was saying, the 8th house person has just gone through a very hard, whether if it was like a romantic disappointment or just a extremely difficult life circumstance, boom, the sun individual walks into their life, and the 8th house person could do a lot of projecting. And I want to say this is probably a major theme of any 8th house connection that I've really, this is like the major theme, is projection. The 8th house person can project a lot of their pain, sorrow, previous experiences, desire, hopes onto the sun individual, and the sun individual can do a lot of projecting in the sense that they see small glimpses of certain weaknesses in the 8th house individual, but usually their perception is very off because they're coming from an egotistical place rather than a compassionate, emotional, tender place like the moon. But anyways, and so a lot of the time, sometimes the way I've seen it work out is that the sun individual, because they're not, maybe not taking it as seriously. They could be deeply attracted, right? Deeply intrigued and, supportive and really care about the 8th house individual. But, there are things in the 8th house person that they think they understand, and it causes them to kind of make an even bigger mess of the 8th house individual's life. Just by being insensitive, just by being egotistical, being just completely unaware of the gravity of how the situation or relationship might affect the 8th house person. So this is what I meant by it can seem like a very one-sided experience for the 8th house person. This could be, it's like the 8th house person could have gone through so much already. And then to have somebody come in and make an even bigger mess. It's almost like it gets worse before it gets better type of situation, you know, or they just get hit with another one, you know. And I'm not saying that 8th house connections can't work out. You know, Sun in the 8th house is one of those, it's harder than other 8th house connections because we're dealing with the ego rather than, and there's really, when it comes to the 8th house person, this is not an egotistical place. It's a very sensitive, emotional, vulnerable, tender place in another person's chart. So yeah, another way that I've seen it work out is, and unfortunately in my personal experience, I haven't really seen an 8th house experience, Sun in the 8th house experience that has actually worked out and lasted. So I'm not saying that it can't for you, but I'm just saying I haven't seen it. And this is a very, very hard thing to stomach. And of course you'll have to go through the experience yourself. But so maybe you live out that positive experience, right? But anyway, and of course it all comes down to what you make of it. You know, if let's say you're going through a disappointment of the 8th house, glean every positive thing that you can from it. Do as much self-reflection as you possibly can, because this is really going to determine your next stage, you know, whether or not you end up encountering this type of situation again or not. You know, it always comes down to what lessons you have to learn. Once you finally gotten to that place of healthy, you know, boundaries, relationships, healing from the past, you're probably going to stop experiencing 8th house, especially Sun in the 8th house connections. Okay. Last but not least, you know, and this video is going on a little bit longer than I expected, but that's okay. Another way that I've seen it work out is, you know, kind of back to the projection situation. A lot of the time, or some of the time, you could see a lot of, you know, let's say we're in a situation where the 8th house person is a lot more mature and emotionally, spiritually open, evolved, healed, right? What's funny about 8th house connections, especially with the Sun here, is that if the if the 8th house individual is a very perceptive and spiritually in tune person, they're really going to see the pains, the flaws, the heartache of the Sun person, because there's an aspect of that within them as well. So there's this deep level of understanding on the part of the 8th house person, and the Sun person usually in all of these situations does a lot of projecting onto the 8th house person. I've seen it in all of these three situations that I'm mentioning. The Sun individual does a lot of projecting onto the 8th house, whether if it's the 8th house person's intentions or the reasons why the 8th house person does and says certain things. It's usually very clouded by fear. You know, the 8th house person can be kind of scary to the Sun individual because there's really nothing in common that the Sun has with the 8th house person, unless the Sun individual is very Plutonian in nature. But even in this case, it might not be, it still could definitely work out in the sense that they just don't trust something within the 8th house person. They might not know what it is, but there's just an extreme level of projecting that the Sun person does. And so the Sun person can really, you know, during this projecting process, really push the 8th house person away, because they are projecting all of their negative experiences, a lot of their heartaches, a lot of their unhealed wounds onto the eighth house person, because there's something in the eighth house person that triggers the heck out of them. You know, there's it's just so funny the way that it works out sometimes, you know. But there's one thing that I would have to say is that there's you know, usually, not always, it depends on the sun person, but there can be an extreme level of attachment here with any sun, well, any eighth house connection, whether it be sun or something else, because of, you know, and it depends on how deep they went. You know, the level of attachment really depends on how physically intimate, how emotionally intimate they went. The deeper they went, the harder it's going to be to let go. I mean, this is with any situation, I think. But, you know, if they went really deep, the sun individual is going to be fighting an aspect of themselves, because they're drawn in, but then they might even be repulsed because they don't understand why the eighth house person does what they do. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and leave it there. I might make a part 2. I think my next video will be maybe a moon in the eighth house or something like that. I don't know. I might make more just personal heavenly body placements and continue on the series that I restarted. So with all that being said, like, subscribe, leave me a comment, share your story, and definitely reach out to me for a reading. I'm still putting back up the website that has all the listings and the pricings of my the astrological services and the coaching services that I offer. But for now, just look in the description of the video and email me, okay, for any type of reading or personal coaching. All right, I'll see you. Thank you for watching. Love you. Deuces.